You're listening to the Interactome, a podcast by a group of young researchers who want to connect you to the world of science by sharing their stories and perspectives. Just in case their bosses are listening, they want to remind you that the opinions expressed here are their own. They also want to remind you not to take anything they say as medical or professional advice, as they are not doctors. Not yet, anyway. Stay tuned about that. And, without further ado, welcome to the Interactome.
Hello and welcome back to the Interactome. I'm one of your hosts, Natalie. I've also got Sarah and Maia with me. I'll let them intro in just a second, but also want to shout out our guest today, Professor Alex Champagne of University of Southern Indiana. He studies evolutionary physiology, and we're going to talk about birds. And let me tell you, I've been yearning for this episode. I am such a bird person, and we're finally doing it, and I'm thrilled. But I'll pass it along to my co-host to let them say hi before we jump in.
Hey everyone, it's Sarah. I know it's been a long time since I've been on the show, but I'm really excited to be on this episode. I am probably a full year older at this point, so excited to see what kinds of things come out of this. It's been a long time since I took Bio 2, Intro Bio 2, which is when we had our little discussion on bird physiology, so I'm really throwing it back with this one.
Wow, and hi guys, I'm Maia. I'm the last co-host on today's episode. I'm really excited to talk with Alex today because I feel like I don't know much about evolution, physiology, or birds, so I'm excited for this triple threat lesson. And to echo off of Natalie's point, who's a bird person, I feel like I myself am surrounded by bird people in my grad school program right now, so I feel like I've just been tangentially getting bird information and bird excitement off of them. So I'm really excited to learn more.
And I'll pass it over to Alex to give us a little intro.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on this podcast and thrilled to be passing along some bird information and bird excitement. So
yes.
I'm very excited.
And for some background, I, no joke, found Alex on Twitter. I one time tweeted about, I think it was Blue Jays, and he liked a tweet that I had about Blue Jays, so I followed him and he followed me back, and we were talking. This is just some inside baseball for our listeners. We were kind of talking or internally as a team, what do we want to do next? And I was like, I follow this guy on Twitter. He's really into birds and he's a professor. Let's just ask him. So I actually emailed Alex and sent a link to my Twitter, and he DM'd me on Twitter to be like, is this you? I just want to make sure. And I was like, no, it's true. Come join the show. But other than that, I think we'd love to hear about, how you ended up in the role that you are now, and just a little bit of your background.
Yeah, happy to do that. I think in my defense, you had DM'd me, and I think I actually looked up the podcast, and I saw you had just done an episode on cybersecurity. So I was like, I need to be really vigilant about this. So, but yeah, I'm glad that it really was you, and I'm glad that it's glad that we made this happen. But yeah, just to give you a little bit of my background, I guess some people might even say I really had no choice in terms of getting into birds and nature and everything like that. When my dad was the director of a nature center, and so just growing up, all of our family vacations were somehow aligned with natural history, whether we were going to some state park or national park. Even if it wasn't, say, a formal natural history tour my dad was leading, if it was me, my dad, and my mom, we would just always be, observing the plants and animals around us as we were going on vacations or just doing things on weekends, all that type of thing. And so, yeah, that's what got me into the environment and science. And so when I came time to go to college, I guess you might even say I was in a little bit of a phase at that point. I thought, I'm going to go into pre-med, like a lot of people do. And for me, it was a phase. I know it's not a phase for everyone.
Guilty.
But, at some point, I got to organic chemistry, which gets a lot of people, including me. And at that point, I decided to kind of get back to my roots, start taking some classes in ecology, that sort of thing. And by the time I got to sort of near graduation, I knew I wanted to do something with birds in graduate school. So I kind of looked around, saw people that were working with birds, ended up linking up with Joe Williams at Ohio State University, who was an evolutionary physiologist, and started looking at sort of how birds are able to live in certain environments. And I'll admit also here too, it was maybe a little bit of a adjustment for me, because at first I very quickly realized that doing evolutionary physiology is a lot more molecular than I thought it was going to be. I was just wanting to play with birds basically, but turns out you actually have to start looking at things like lipid molecules and that sort of thing. And maybe a little bit discouraging for me at first, and this is why I sometimes call myself sort of a reluctant lipid biochemist. I wasn't necessarily looking to get into it right off the bat, but eventually I was able to find a collaborator, Heather Allen, also at Ohio State University, who's a physical chemist, got me using some techniques like infrared spectroscopy, ironically things that I didn't like when I took organic chemistry, but now seeing an application for them really allowed me to say, okay, if I can use this organic chemistry tool to figure out how birds are able to live in their environments, I'm going to go ahead and use that. So that's kind of how my career has kind of taken this windy road to where it is now.
You know, I completely agree with you. I feel like they should really restructure organic chemistry classes, because that almost made me quit being a scientist too. So I feel like when you said that, it was like kind of framed in a way that would allow you to like answer the research questions you're most interested in. I'm like, maybe I would have liked organic chemistry a little better if they added a little context to it.
I've always thought an applied organic chemistry class would really be a useful class for a lot of biologists, especially because I know there's a few lipid biologists in my program here at grad school, and it's really complicated. So I think you need to know a lot of chemistry. So I have a lot of respect for the lipid biochemists. Yeah, and sometimes I'll admit I kind of fake it a little bit, and I talk to somebody who actually knows a little bit more than I do about it all.
That's what this whole podcast is. Let me tell you, we're faking it, and then we're asking the pros.
In case, I think that's the best way that you learn about stuff, you know?
Yep, there's always going to be someone who knows way more than you do, so you might as well just ask them.
Very true, Dit.
So in your role at University of Southern Indiana, you teach a couple classes. You teach animal physiology and ornithology. So one thing that we really want to walk through on this episode is sort of a bird physiology 101 kind of course. One thing that I learned when I was studying science in undergrad is that structure and function are deeply interwoven in pretty much anything that has to do with biology and physiology. And I imagine that is certainly the case here too. So I guess we'll kind of jump in there. How do you maybe define physiology, and how does it relate to evolution as a whole?
Yeah, so when I define physiology on its most basic level, we're just thinking of how, at least for animals, we're thinking of how animals work. And the way I generally approach physiology, whether it's in my animal physiology or my ornithology course, is we're thinking about how animals' physiology has come about in the context of basically selection for that animal's lifestyle or that animal's environment. That's sort of this broad encompassing field of evolutionary physiology is just focusing on those aspects of physiology.
Yeah, and I guess too, what I'll say is know that birds are found on every continent on this planet, right? And a lot of extreme environments too. So I think that's what makes bird physiology and ornithology especially interesting case study for studying how structure informs function. So maybe are there ways that, you know, bird physiology really kind of stands out in your mind in comparison to maybe other animal physiology, or how extreme environments could have played a role in physical attributions to birds that maybe other animals don't have?
Very, very good question. And it really kind of ties in a lot of things about birds. I think one of the reasons a lot of us get into birds is because they're so visible all the time. You can go out during the day, just like when we're awake, and so are the birds for the most part. And so what that then ultimately means from a bird's point of view is that they're dealing with the elements. They're not like a lot of mammals or other animals that are maybe, say, burrowing in some sort of substrate or something like that. They're actually facing sort of the full brunt of what's going on in the outside environment. And so when we think about how physiology is going to evolve there, one of the principles we talk about in animal physiology especially is what we call the August Crow principle, which is this idea that if you're studying physiology, you should try to study animals that sort of exemplify some aspect of physiology, sort of the extreme, or that are living in some sort of extreme environment. You basically look for the most extreme case you can to sort of see an exaggerated version of whatever that physiological trait is. And so when it comes to birds, again, just the fact that they are in those elements at all times. If it's a cold environment, the birds are going to be cold. If it's hot, they're going to be hot. And so as a result of that, you don't necessarily find physiological adaptation blunted like it might be for some animal that can change its behavior in some way to maybe get around some physiological impediments. Not to say birds don't also have some behavioral adjustments they make too, but maybe a little bit more so than most animals. They're having to really face those elements.
I have a question. So, for example, like if we're considering like the extreme cases of bird physiology, would a penguin be an example of that since they live in very cold climates?
Yeah, I think penguins are a great example of something like that, because especially you think of, say, emperor penguins where the males are trying to raise the eggs and chicks in these just really extremely cold sorts of environments. That's an extreme environment right there. And so when it comes to, say, people studying, say, thermoregulation in cold environments, a natural study organism oftentimes is penguins. When people look for things like uncoupling proteins, for example, which are these proteins that can generate heat within an organism, if people are searching for them, they're going to search for them in penguins, for example.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I did hear of like a biologist somewhere like using elephant seals for like a similar reason, because they're in very cold climates. But I imagine, like, is it true that birds need a lot more energy compared to other, I guess, like organisms? I guess like my thought behind that was that I always thought that like birds need a lot of energy because they fly. But I guess penguins don't fly, they swim. But is that kind of the same idea?
So some of the activity maybe plays a part in it, but it maybe stems a little bit further back in some ways. So the major reason why birds need more energy than a lot of other animals is because when you look at the body temperature that they're regulating within themselves, birds generally run about 2 degrees Celsius hotter than we do as mammals, for example. We regulate our body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius, birds around 39, even 40 in some cases. And so because of that, if you have a higher body temperature, that means you're now losing more heat to your environment, and you have to replace that heat by raising your metabolic rate. And so birds have generally a high metabolic rate in general because they're maintaining that high body temperature. So that then kind of begs the question, well, why do they have a high body temperature? And that's where it kind of comes back to the activity part. So if you have a higher body temperature, things like neurons can transmit faster at higher temperatures than at lower temperatures. And you think about all the coordination needed to fly, for example, that's going to require very fast neurotransmission. And so having a high body temperature helps with that. And so, yeah, it's all kind of tied together, which I think is just a really cool thing about physiology in general, is that it all kind of comes back at some point.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, I feel like even the like too little degrees of Celsius higher can offer a lot of changes, which is kind of surprising to me.
I also remember from like intro bio too, which is so long ago. But I just was like so fascinated by bird physiology in the sense of like their heart and lungs. We really focused on those two systems and just like how we ended up doing a little bit of comparative physiology between, I think, birds, fish, and humans. And I just remember the bird physiologic system being so efficient to like a very, very fascinating point. So I don't know if you're able to comment more on that from an evolution perspective. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is when we start thinking about the respiratory system, especially of birds. I think things get really interesting here in terms of when some of these systems evolved. So when you look at a bird's respiratory system, you may remember this from intro bio, but they have what's called a unidirectional lung system, where basically a bird's respiratory system is this sort of network of, they have the lungs themselves, but then they also have all these air sacs. Like if you ever dissect a bird, there's just a bunch of air in there because you're cutting into these air sacs. It's not like when you dissect a mammal and the guts kind of spill out. But it's just a lot of air inside of there. It's all these air sacs. And these air sacs are basically functioning kind of like a blacksmith's bellows to sort of just pump. They're just expanding and contracting to pump air across the bird's respiratory surface, across its lungs proper. And it does so in just a single direction. So you have air that's always just flowing in a single direction. And because of that setup, it's a lot more conducive to extracting oxygen from the air because you're always bringing fresh air across the respiratory surface. It's not like in our lungs where we bring in air, it sits in our lungs for a little while, kind of gets stale while it's in there, and then we exhale it. But we in birds, we're talking about this consistent fresh air that's just going across their respiratory system. And so it allows birds to just achieve some awesome feats. For example, there's I think the record among birds in terms of altitude was a griffin vulture that got sucked into a jet engine at like 39,000 feet or something like that. So
whoa!
Unfortunately, it didn't survive its record-breaking attempt, but it's just amazing really how high they can get up in altitude. It really speaks to their ability to efficiently extract oxygen, because if we're at that altitude, we're putting on oxygen masks and we're not doing so well. But so the bird lung again helps them at these in terms of flying, and so you start to look at a lot of ornithology textbooks, and they talk about how a bird's lung is an adaptation for flight, and that's something that makes a lot of sense to us when we see what birds are capable of doing in terms of extracting oxygen. But then you start to look back in the fossil record, and you start to see that theropod dinosaurs, the ancestors of birds which didn't fly, also had unidirectional lungs. And so then it kind of gets to this distinction of, it's not really an adaptation then that these birds have unidirectional lungs. It was sort of this pre-existing structure, something we call pre-adaptation, where it definitely helped them evolve into flight, but it wasn't necessarily a structure that came directly for flight.
Wait, so I don't know, sorry, this is just in my mind, like, why would dinosaurs have something like that, right? I'm almost picturing it like an extra, like, sac or compartment that just is able to pump that fresh air across the lungs, right? But, like, I wonder why dinosaurs would evolve to have that sort of extra compartment.
I think that's something people are still debating in a lot of ways. We think about how we've changed our thought about dinosaurs over the years. I remember when I was a kid, the thought was that dinosaurs were just these cold-blooded reptiles, and they maybe weren't the fastest moving things in the world, but we're increasingly finding out that theropod dinosaurs, a lot of other dinosaurs from other lineages too, were a lot more active than we thought. They definitely had a high metabolic rate, and were definitely doing things that required probably endothermic activity in terms of, they were definitely regulating their body temperature in many cases. And, having unidirectional lungs, I'm sure definitely helped in terms of that lifestyle. So that's probably the best explanation people have right now.
I'd like to kind of zoom out real quick because we're talking about adaptations, pre-adaptations, and I wonder too if our listeners might be interested in hearing how that relates to evolution. So it's funny, when we were doing our kind of preliminary call to this, I was sort of like, yeah, but adaptation means evolution, right? And Alex had corrected me. He was, no, not quite. You know, you have adaptations, they relate, but they're not necessarily like kind of a mutually exclusive, I think is the term that I'm looking for. So maybe you could get into a little bit, maybe at a high level, about how adaptations inform evolution or vice versa.
Sure. So when we think about an adaptation, if we really want to sort of strictly define that in an evolutionary sense, it's, adaptation is a word we kind of use for a lot of different contexts in our day-to-day lives. But if we're thinking about it in an evolutionary sense, we're thinking about a trait that has evolved for a specific purpose because it allowed individuals with that trait to survive and reproduce better than individuals without that trait. And so when we think about an adaptation, we're oftentimes linking a trait specifically to some sort of environmental or lifestyle change that animal had within its evolutionary history. So that's sort of the definition we would put in there for adaptation. And evolution is just something we just more broadly define as changes in genetic frequencies at a population level over periods of time, which can sometimes be influenced by natural selection and adaptation, but sometimes can be caused by other things too.
And that's what's really putting my brain in a blender here, is the idea that, we've got kind of the idea of those air pockets and those unidirectional lungs, and scientists for so long were like, oh, that was them evolving to get to flight, right? That's how we got flightless birds birds in the first place. But it's so interesting to kind of pull the hood back and just say, like, that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's actually so much more convoluted than that when you're evolving into something that takes flight. And later in this episode, we'll talk about long distance migrants too, but it's rarely ever one trait, one adaptation that leads to that big cascading effect.
I have a question. So I know you mentioned the fossil record, Alex, so to tie into our conversation about adaptations and evolution. How did people know that dinosaurs had unidirectional lungs? Like, it doesn't get left behind in the fossil, right? So that's like the tricky thing with evolution that's always got me, is that like you can't exactly like go in a time machine and go all the way back and like see all of the stuff that was there, all the organisms that were there and all the traits they had. So how are people kind of like inferring or proving that dinosaurs had traits like unidirectional lungs?
Yeah, great question. You're definitely right, Maya, that a lot of times soft tissue doesn't really do so well in terms of the fossilization process, although sometimes I know right now bird fossils and some dinosaur fossils are being found at just amazing rates in China right now. It seems like every day you hear a new study coming out of China that shows some great new fossil that's been found and puts another piece into the evolutionary puzzle. But when it comes to this question of unidirectional lungs, what people have found is that so if you look on a bird's skeleton, you look at its rib cage, there's these little outgrowths of the ribs, almost like little struts coming off the ribs that we refer to as uncinate processes. And these are little pieces of bone that basically kind of act as little levers, and they're helping a bird to expand and contract its rib cage, and therefore expand and contract those air sacs. And people have looked at a lot of theropod dinosaurs, and they have uncinate processes on their ribs. And so just being able to see that sort of convergence there is, well, not really convergence in that case, but just a similarity that we're looking at there is some nice evidence that birds had those unidirectional lungs too.
Well, that's so cool. I feel like I did not know too much about the insides of birds because before I thought the outside of birds were very cool. But it's really fascinating.
It's all cool. That's what you're going to learn from this episode.
But no, it's really cool to know kind of like what's exactly happening inside a bird. And now I'm like, why isn't the world just ruled by birds if like their neurons are firing faster and like they have enhanced metabolism and they have like these cool lungs that are like very oxygen efficient? Like, that's crazy.
So we talked a little bit at the top of the episode about, Alex, your work as a reluctant biochemist and how you were surprised that as you went into physiology, you learned that it was a lot more molecular than maybe kind of surface level that you had thought. And this certainly informs your work now. And I know you're doing some really interesting work with lipids and studying them in the context of ornithology. So would love to kind of give you the floor and let you give a little bit of a high summary of that.
Okay, yeah, I'll do the best I can there. So
I know it's a charged question, right?
Yeah, definitely feel free to stop me at any time if you have some follow-ups or anything that I didn't clarify very well here. So just to sort of think about where I got started in terms of the question that I originally started answering way back when I started in graduate school, is my advisor and I were interested in how birds are able to regulate water loss in different environments. My advisor had done a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, working in these sort of hyper-arid deserts where there's these birds that are just able to survive in extremely hot, dry conditions. And what he had found before I even got into the lab is that birds are basically one of their biggest pressures in terms of how they're able to conserve water is being able to conserve water that's evaporating through their skin. So at most temperatures, most of a bird's water is actually lost as it basically permeates through the bird's skin and then out into the outside environment. And so just kind of goes to follow then that if you have a skin, or if you're able to adapt and have some sort of skin that's a little bit less permeable to water, you're maybe going to be able to survive better in these more arid environments. And so he and some of his students had looked and seen that the really key here is these lipid molecules that are within the skin. And this is true of humans too. Lipid molecules in our skin are basically our barrier to what we call cutaneous water loss, water that's lost through our skin.
And what is a lipid?
A lipid, if we want to just think about a very easy definition of a lipid is a fat. And so that includes things like cholesterol or things like fatty acids, all those types of things. Anything that has, in general, a lot of hydrocarbons associated with it. Oftentimes, at least when we're thinking about lipids that are in the skin of an animal, we're thinking about lipids that have usually a hydrocarbon chain with some sort of more polar head group that can maybe interact with water molecules or with each other through things like hydrogen bonding, that sort of thing. So yeah, it turns out if you look at an animal's skin, if you were to remove our lipids, you would basically increase our water loss a lot. And one of the biggest lipids, in fact, that we find in a lot of vertebrates in general is something called a ceramide. And you've maybe even seen these in products before. There's a whole line of products out there called like CeraVe that advertises itself as having these ceramides in them.
Yeah, I instantly just like visualized it in my head along with like a sweaty bird that needs to have like improved like lipid composition to keep in the water. But no, that
sounds
yeah.
like a good marketing plan right there.
I think that's our next Super Bowl commercial. Like CeraVe, call us up.
Sweaty bird.
All right, they have to keep the water in. Keep it in.
Maybe that's the name of this episode, is just Sweaty Birds.
I don't know. Would people want to listen
Throwing
to
it
that?
out there.
Would people really want to listen to
True, so true. Anyway, we were talking about
ceramides.
Birds retaining water.
This is actually a question that I asked. So I mentioned that like there's like lipid biology here and there in my grad school coursework. So when I learned about ceramides for the first time, I actually like asked the other student in my lab. I was like, is this related to CeraVe? Like it says it has essential ceramides in it. And he was like, yep, it's a really good lipid. It's like really waxy, and like it's great to put it in lotion because it'll keep the moisture in your skin, which will help prevent the dryness of your skin, which is why you would use lotion. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Ceramides are super important in mammals. And so if you look at our skin, I think roughly a third of our lipids are ceramides, and that's thought to be pretty much the biggest barrier to water loss. And what's kind of interesting about this when we sort of then pivot this into birds is that birds also have ceramides in their skin, but then they have another lipid that's called a cerebroside in their skin, which is basically a ceramide, but it also has on its head group, it has a little glucose molecule. So it's just a sugar molecule attached to it. And so for that reason, it's maybe able to interact with water a little bit more. It also is maybe a little bit bulkier because sugars can kind of hinder each other as they start to pack them together. And so people who had come into this lab at Ohio State before me had found that birds have a lot of these cerebrosides, and in fact, these birds that live in deserts have more of these cerebrosides. And this is actually a little bit puzzling because if you look at mammals, we don't have cerebrosides unless we have this pathological condition called Gaucher's disease. And people with Gaucher's disease actually have really high rates of water loss. So it's actually a sort of an opposite effect that we're seeing in birds versus in mammals when it comes to what these cerebrosides are doing. So that was kind of where I came in, trying to basically figure out what are these cerebrosides doing. And so started using techniques like infrared spectroscopy to sort of figure out how are these molecules interacting with one another in the skin. And one of the main things I found is that there is some pretty good evidence that cerebrosides in bird skin seem to be binding with water molecules and kind of structuring them, maybe even kind of holding water in the skin. It's maybe a great moisturizer. Maybe CeraVe could do even better if they put some cerebrosides in there. I don't know. But so yeah, that seems to be what's going on in birds. And so that was, again, pretty fascinating stuff. And I think you can kind of come back to, well, why don't cerebrosides work out so well in mammals? And that's sort of up for debate, although I think the one thing that we've maybe found that may sort of be an explanation is that I mentioned that cerebrosides are bulky, and at least in mammals, we have a lot of other bulky molecules within our skin lipids. We have a lot of cholesterol. Cholesterol makes up maybe about a third or at least 25% of our lipids. And cholesterol is pretty bulky. Maybe if you mix it with a really bulky cerebroside, it's just too much bulk. Lipids can't pack together. But birds actually have very, very small amounts of cholesterol. And so that's why I'm thinking maybe cerebrosides work well in a bird skin there. So it's just this different mixture.
That's interesting. So it's kind of like this idea of like balancing maybe like bulky and non-bulky lipids within an organism.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think some of the evidence actually has come from looking also at bats. So one of my colleagues started looking at bats and looking at their lipids. And lo and behold, he finds they have cerebrosides also. And so this is the first documented case of a mammal having large amounts of cerebrosides in their skin. And then you start to look at it, and bats still have some cholesterol, but definitely a lot less than what we see in a lot of, say, in humans or a lot of terrestrial mammals in general. So that was kind of another cool piece of the puzzle. And then if we start to think a little bit further into this, we can think about why cerebrosides. And you think about bats, you think about birds, they both fly. And so this kind of led to this hypothesis that, well, maybe cerebrosides are not just there to prevent water loss, but maybe they originally even evolved in some way because they can bind with water, they can hydrate the skin. And if you're flying, you need to have very pliable, hydrated skin to deal with those stresses of flight. And so that was sort of the hypothesis that kind of came out of that. So it kind of shows how over time we can sort of adapt our thinking about what some of these different molecules are doing and what they could have evolved for.
And are cerebrosides linked to flight?
Not necessarily. That was our thought at first. But then very recently I started looking, well, I guess to even back up a little bit, if we're thinking about things on an evolutionary trajectory, if we want to think about how did cerebrosides get into birds, the natural sort of way of going about that would be to see, are cerebrosides present in some of the ancestors of birds? And the ancestors of birds are all extinct, so we can't really see if they had cerebrosides. But the next best thing would be the closest living relatives of birds, and that happens to be crocodilians, alligators and crocodiles. And so I was able to find a alligator trapper, I guess. He's a person who has worked with alligators all over the place. He has all kinds of stories himself, Frank Robb, and he was able to hook me up with some alligator skin. And so he got this stuff and he shipped it up to USI, and myself and a student of mine, we started looking at the alligator skin, and we found cerebrosides in alligator skin. And alligators can't fly, thankfully, but we did at least kind of show that maybe cerebrosides can't actually or aren't actually there for flight. So that kind of got us thinking, well, why are they there if they're not there for flight? And they're also not there for water loss, because alligators, they're a pretty aquatic animal. They actually have really high rates of water loss through their skin. And so I started kind of looking at the structure of alligator skin, and my student and I were both looking at this. And you notice that when you look at alligator skin, they have this arrangement of their skin where they got these really hard plates of, we always associate alligator skin as being super tough and super hard. And it's because they have these plates made of this very rigid protein, and then in between they have more flexible hinges that can kind of move and allow the animal to move around. And so maybe an alligator can't fly, but those hinges, which is actually where most of the lipids are located based on what we know, those are going to need to be very, very pliable. And so at least, based on a paper I'm going through right now that's going through the editing process and everything like that, we're sort of advancing this hypothesis that maybe cerebrosides are there to provide strength and pliability to the skin, just maybe in a different way than we thought. It's not necessarily a flight-linked thing. It's more just a sort of skin structure thing. And also, this would potentially mean that if you were to look in dinosaur skin or pterosaur skin, they would probably also have cerebrosides.
Whoa, that's so cool. I feel like this to me at least is a very satisfying answer, because I'm like, oh, like the pieces of the puzzle, like the birds and the alligators and everything, like how could this explain? And I guess like maybe the reason that people don't have a lot of cerebrosides, or maybe it's not like the dominant one, is because like maybe cholesterol just happened to be the dominant bulky lipid that we have. No, it's cool. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I think in at least in human skin, cholesterol kind of maybe is not binding with water, but it's at least sort of structuring other lipids around it in a different way. And if you're thinking about mammals too, we never really had this arrangement of, even though we got some sort of hard keratin areas in our body, we don't have this armor sort of around our body that would sort of necessitate some of that flexibility. So we're just seeing different lifestyles, different evolutionary trajectories just lead to these very deep molecular differences between animals.
Oh, that's so cool. And then we also talked about like how like birds are pretty different, like even within, like if you're considering like all birds, they're very different birds within that. Like let's say like you compare like a pigeon to a penguin to a vulture to a chickadee. But is it correct that all birds just like baseline have more cerebrosides, and then maybe some birds that like you said, like live in the desert or require kind of like more protection for keeping the water inside their skins, like they have more cerebrosides than the baseline for all birds?
Yeah, absolutely true. So when we look at all birds, they're having cerebrosides, but then some birds that are adapted to certain, especially dry environments, tend to have elevated levels. And that's not just true on an evolutionary scale, where we're thinking of actual adaptations to dry environments, but if you were to take a bird, if I were to take a bird from Indiana today and bring it into the lab and put it into a very dry environment, it would actually incorporate more cerebrosides into its skin.
Oh, that's crazy.
Whoa.
I could never turn it into like a desert bird, but I could at least make it increase its cerebrosides.
Where is it getting the cerebrosides from?
It's basically manufacturing it, and
that's cool.
The way this link hasn't been super well established, but in basically what happens in humans, for example, is we actually, if you were to look in our deeper layers of our skin, we have cerebrosides there, like down in the lower layers of our epidermis. But basically, by the time those cerebrosides get put out into, we start with these lipids that are inside of our cells, and they kind of get extruded outside of the cells and pushed out, and then they undergo a lot of processing by enzymes. And so there's an enzyme within our skin called beta-glucocerebrosidase, which basically just takes that sugar and it just cleaves it off. So it turns the cerebroside into a ceramide. And so probably what also is going on, if we're thinking about whether a bird, say, has more cerebrosides or less, probably changing its activity of that enzyme.
Whoa.
That's so cool.
I look forward to the paper when it comes out.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Wow.
And that's one thing, too, we love on this show is that we love to demonstrate that science isn't one moment in time. It's not like you hear those stories of, this guy discovered the cell for the first time, but actual complicated scientific theories and topics always kind of expand way more than, what meets the eye. And I will say, too, I'm interested in, this is a conversation for a different day, but how this cerebroside adaptation for birds, kind of like that short-term adaptation you were talking about, where if, you take a bird from Indiana and put it, in Saudi Arabia, and it may produce more cerebrosides, how that's going to change with climate change. We're seeing such rapid droughts, everything's changing, and I'm interested to see how, and we won't know, obviously, for quite some time, but how that will impact bird physiology and adaptation. So, and we would be also remiss to have a bird episode and not talk about one of the big bird physiology debates, which is flightless versus flight birds, and the whole concept of how flight came about. So listeners, if you heard our RNA episode, we kind of talked about the origins of RNA a little bit, and Alex is going to walk us through the debate of, I'm not going to pronounce this fossil right. I'm just not going to do it. It's Archaeopteryx?
Archaeopteryx?
Thank you. Alex is going to walk us through the debate of both sides and how that pertains to flight now.
Yay, I love a debate.
Yeah, this is something that really, I think when it comes down to something like Archaeopteryx, I think, have all of you heard of Archaeopteryx before?
Yes.
Considering I couldn't pronounce it, let's do a refresher. I think that would be good.
Sounds good.
It's a tough word.
It is.
It is a tough word. So Archaeopteryx, at least, when I was a kid looking through dinosaur books, people always talked about it as sort of, even they would even use this terminology, the first bird, where sort of it was this first fossil where people looked at it and they could actually see, that looks like a bird. And they probably even saw that before they even really realized that birds came from dinosaurs. They just kind of saw that here's something that kind of looks like a dinosaur in some ways, but it also has these feathers, and it has a lot of bird-like features. And so it's something that has sort of undergone some different levels of scrutiny throughout the years, and there's even probably people out there who would say it's really not quite as important of a fossil as we maybe once thought it was, because we've made so many other discoveries since that time. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating about Archaeopteryx, and we talk about this in my ornithology class, we just kind of go through the evidence of, could Archaeopteryx fly, or was it just like a lot of its other theropod dinosaur relatives where it maybe couldn't fly? And so there's a lot of evidence in both ways, and what's really fascinating to me about all this is that it's one of those instances where everybody's looking at the same fossils. Like, there's only a few Archaeopteryx fossils out there, but everybody has a different interpretation, which always kind of speaks, this isn't unique to paleontology. People probably even look at some of the stuff that I've been talking about today and may have a very different interpretation. But so yeah, we always like to go over what is the evidence that it could fly, what's the evidence that it couldn't fly, and then we always kind of never really come to a conclusion at the end. But it's always fun to go through the evidence. So if we're looking at, like, say, the evidence that it could fly, we look at Archaeopteryx, and it has these feathers, and overall it seems to have much larger sort of wings than you might expect for a lot of its theropod dinosaur relatives. Some of its feathers are asymmetrical on its wings, and that's a characteristic of modern day flight feathers on birds. Instead of being symmetrical in terms of that central feather vein and the different things coming off that central shaft, it's actually asymmetrical, where the barbs are a little bit shorter on one side than they are on the other. And so there's some of that. There's also, people have looked at like the cranial structure and found that maybe certain parts of the brain that would help with balance and all these features associated with flight maybe cluster a little bit more with birds than they do with reptiles. And so there's a lot of different pieces of evidence like that. But then other people point out, these Archaeopteryx, despite the fact that it has feathers, actually has a pretty heavy skeleton. It doesn't necessarily have a sternum that would have allowed it to have these large pectoral muscles that would enable it to really draw a lot of power from it, like a modern day bird does. They would even look at, probably one of my favorite back and forths about it is, people have looked at the feather shafts of the wings on Archaeopteryx, and they found that, compare with modern day birds, those feathers are a lot thinner. And so they argue, well, then these feathers are just super brittle, they'd be breaking if this bird started to fly. But then some other people look at that, and you look at Archaeopteryx's wing, and there's a lot more overlap of feathers than you see on a modern day bird. So then there's other people that say, okay, our feather shafts are thin and maybe breakable, but you have all this collective strength from all these overlapping feathers, and that would have allowed these wings to be just fine. So again, it's just one of those instances where people looking at the same fossil and gleaning some very different pieces of information from it.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So interesting.
Yeah, because I feel like we talked about a little something about this, like in our RNA episode that Natalie mentioned. We were debating the different hypotheses for how RNA came about in the world, and something we touched on was that, whatever progenitor RNA that was back in the primordial soup, it was probably like really different compared to like the RNA that we have today. So hearing the points for and against did Archaeopteryx fly or not fly kind of reminded me of that. So I was thinking, maybe we discussed that Archaeopteryx has the flight, the feathers on the skeleton, but maybe it's not flying in the way that we would expect like modern day birds to fly. So for me, at least, that's kind of like a point that I like to keep in mind. So maybe even though the feathers share some characteristics with modern birds, like you said, Alex, but they're like less than optimal, it could be okay for whatever maybe minimal flight it was doing back in the day in prehistoric times. What do you guys think?
Back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you guys pro or against Archaeopteryx flying?
We're going to settle the debate right now.
Well, I was going to ask too, like, is this sort of like, is Archaeopteryx sort of like the I don't know what the phrase is, but is Archaeopteryx the most heavily debated fossil in the world of ornithology in this flighted versus flightless birds debate? Or have there been other fossils too that have kind of come up in this sort of in-between questionable range that people are still trying to work out?
Archaeopteryx is probably the most well-known overall. If there's maybe one other fossil that I think maybe has encountered some debate too, it's there's a fossil out there called Microraptor, which to me is just a really crazy fossil because
I love that name.
yeah, you got to picture a cute little Jurassic Park raptor.
Yeah.
Wait, this is so cute. I just looked it up.
Oh, describe for the class, please.
They're maybe they're actually pretty cute. And what I think is really fascinating about Microraptor is that it has wings, but then it also has like pretty long feathers on its legs, which some modern day birds have like a little bit of feathering on their legs, but we're talking like things that almost look like flight feathers on their wings. And so there's all kinds of debate about, did it fly kind of like a biplane or something like that, where it's using those legs and the arms? And so there's all kinds of debate about what Microraptor, how that might have flown. And so there's all kinds of debates out there. And one other thing that I think is really interesting about all this too is that we're considering whether it's Archaeopteryx or Microraptor or any of these fossils. I think a lot of arguments are sort of thinking about whether these animals could fly in today's environment. But what's kind of fascinating about it to me is that if you go back to the Jurassic, when Archaeopteryx was around, there was a lot more oxygen in the air at that time, and everything else was pretty consistent with what it is now. So that means your air overall was a lot denser. And so to fly in that environment, you might not need to be quite as well equipped as a bird in today's environment might have had to be. So just thinking about context and environment really matters there.
Well, I didn't know that about the air composition back in the day. Wow. That's crazy. So
there's a whole book out there called Oxygen, which is a really cool book. It came out several years ago, but it kind of talks about this whole idea of oxygen fluctuating in Earth's surface and everything like that.
Whoa.
It's so interesting. I don't know. I'm like, what's in my mind right now is I want to do like another episode with you on like the engineering and like mechanics of flight and how that relates to birds and evolution, but I'll save that for a different time.
I desperately want birds to evolve on another planet with a different atmospheric composition now. I really want it to happen.
But I do want to ask some bird rapid fire questions because I'm just curious. So Dr. Champagne, what is your favorite bird and why?
This is a question I get asked all the time, and I never exactly know how to answer it sometimes. Sometimes I'll say my favorite bird is whatever I saw last. That's my favorite bird. If people really press me on it, I will definitely say that warblers in general are a group of birds that I just really appreciate because I just associate them so much with the changing of the seasons, especially when we think about, say, spring migration. You're getting all these very colorful little birds that are just filling the trees and belting out their songs, and it just is kind of a nice end to the winter. And then people always ask, well, what's your favorite warbler? And there it gets a little bit harder. And I go back and forth between the hooded warbler, the cerulean warbler. It's probably between those two, just because I just associate them with these really nice, like big old growth deciduous forest kind of areas, or just some. I've always just associated birds with places a lot throughout my life, and those two species just kind of evoke a lot of nice memories.
That's
what
lovely.
About like growing up? Did you have a favorite bird or one that really like caught your eye that you wanted to study more?
Not necessarily a specific bird there. What I would say is that when I was a kid, and this is something I go through oftentimes with my ornithology students, is when you start to bird, and maybe Natalie can back me up on this. One of the most frustrating things is finding birds in your binoculars. If you've never used binoculars,
So true.
Yeah, never used binoculars for in your life. It's a very frustrating exercise to find, especially you're thinking about, say, a tiny little warbler in your binoculars. It's so tough. And actually, when I was a kid, I didn't like warblers because they never stayed still. But eventually, my to sort of help with that frustration, my dad really got me into watching ducks. And so ducks, nice and big, you can find them in a scope. They stay a lot more still. And so I really had a lot of good memories. That was sort of my first experience actually learning to identify birds and being a little bit more patient with them. And then that allowed me to buy some time while my binocular skills kind of caught up with the rest of me.
I can attest, I've used binoculars once when I went out birding, and they annoyed me so much that I just didn't use them. I just kept looking up with my regular eyes, because you're right, it's so, you hear them and you're trying to follow them, and it's I can understand how that can get frustrating.
What about the rarest bird that you've ever encountered?
Rarest, this is always a tough one, because I think we can define rare when we think of how birders define a rare bird. There's so many ways we define what a rare bird is. Sometimes it's how likely are you to see it, and sometimes it has to do with that bird's actual population status, for example. So if we're thinking about, say, population status, being able to see, say, federally endangered birds like whooping cranes, California condors, those are thrills for me. Just being able to know you're seeing one of just a few individuals in the entire world, and also for both those species, being able to kind of see them on the upswing in terms of their populations. That's just a encouraging thing to see. And then if I'm thinking about the other ways we define rare, sometimes we have these vagrant birds that are plenty common somewhere else, and locals in those areas might not get excited at all about these birds. But if we see a bird that's suddenly in a place where it shouldn't be, we all get very excited, and we flock to that area because we need it on our local county list, or we need it on our state list, or our life list for North America. And so there's definitely been a whole assortment of different, say, birds from Eurasia or Central America that have come up to the U.S. to sort of bless us with a little bit of a visit sometimes. And so, being able to see green violet or hummingbird when I was a kid in Michigan, that's a bird that should be down in Central America, and seeing it up in Michigan was a big thrill. And just, you get those encounters from time to time. And it's one of those things where I look at rare bird alerts for North America, and I'm always jealous that I don't live in Texas or Arizona or someplace along like a border where you can get these vagrants happening all the time. Here in Indiana, we get lucky every once in a while, but not too often.
How would the hummingbird from Central America make it up to Michigan?
Yeah, so when it comes to these vagrant birds, that's always just such a puzzle as to how they get there. A lot of times it can be linked with just sort of weather patterns that might have blown a bird in a certain direction. Sometimes it even has to do a little bit with the navigation systems of these birds during migration. There's just some fascinating stuff about birds' navigating abilities. I mean, sometimes you can have these birds that they winter in the same location every year, and then they come back to breed in the exact same location they were the previous year. So they're very good at navigating, but every once in a while something will happen that maybe throws their navigational system off in some way or another, and they just end up where they shouldn't be. It's like when our GPS stops working or something like that.
You take a wrong turn somewhere, or you're like, oh, I knew I should have asked for directions somewhere here.
Exactly.
Whoa, that's so cool.
And then I guess the last question that we have is, which birds, if there is one, is there a bird's physiology that stands out the most to you?
This is another one where there's so many cool examples of physiology that stands out. I know when when I talk about bird physiology with my students, we talk about just some of these crazy things about bird physiology, everything ranging from the fact that you can look at, say, a bird's blood plasma and find that it has very high levels of glucose, like levels that would be considered dangerously hyperglycemic if it were in a person, but that's just what birds kind of deal with. Or we think about migrating birds and how they can, within a few days, like double their body weight, and then a few days later, their body weight goes back down because they used it all up. Just these things that, again, would be unsafe for a human. We don't ever want to gain or lose weight that fast. And so yeah, there's just so many examples all over the place. But I guess if I'll offer an unconventional sort of example that we talked about a little bit before. I mentioned that my advisor had gotten his start looking at birds in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things that really intrigued him was that this area of Saudi Arabia was called the Ruba Khali, which means the empty quarter. It's just this barren, hyper-arid area. And there was this expedition that happened a while back through that area, led by a guy named John Philby. And I guess if you look at his journals, he basically writes for a lot of his entries, it's hot, it's dry, the men and the animals are ill-tempered, but we saw a hoopoe lark today. And so he kept just mentioning this bird, the hoopoe lark, and that was a bird that my advisor started studying, and it's just this fascinating bird that it can live in this area where we talked at the very beginning of this episode about how these birds are just facing the brunt of the elements, and here's this bird that's facing the brunt of the elements. It's nesting in these areas where pretty low to the ground, and it's even to the point where my advisor one time caught some birds in his net, and it was a breeding pair of birds, and so the mom and the dad were both off the nest for I think about 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, he checked back on the eggs, and they were hard-boiled. That was how hot it was. And so just this super extremely hot area where these birds are just living on the edge. And so just fascinating when you think about the adaptations associated with that bird being able to live in that area.
Listeners,
for listeners, when Alex said the hard-boiled part, all of our jaws dropped. We were all like, are you kidding? That's crazy.
Wow. So when the hoopoe larks were like nesting on the eggs, is that kind of like cooling them down so that they don't get hard-boiled by the sun?
Yeah, so a lot of times when we think about birds incubating eggs, we think about them keeping them warm, but this is sort of a case where they're kind of just moderating the temperature, maybe even keeping them a little bit cooler. And there was actually, my advisor did this really fascinating study on him one time where he put little temperature transmitters inside of these birds. And so he was actually able to measure their body temperature and how they were changing. And so this is a species where both the male and the female incubate. And so what would happen is basically one of the parents would go on to the nest, and while it was on the nest, its body temperature would be going up to even about like 45 degrees. Like that's a really high body temperature. That would be, whoa. If we had a fever of 45 degrees Celsius, we would be very alarmed by that. But so they would go up to about 45 degrees Celsius, and then right around they hit that point, they would basically switch with their mate. And so their mate would take over the incubation duties, and then the parent, who was up to 45 degrees Celsius, would, they would do one of two things. If it was a windy day, they would perch up in the wind and dump heat that way through like convection from the wind. If it was a still day, what they would do is they would find themselves there's some lizards in this area that have burrows. They would dive down into this lizard burrow, and they'd press themselves against the cool sand in this lizard burrow, and then their temperature would go down. And then just periodically, every like 10, 15 minutes or so, they would switch with their mate. It's almost like, almost like if you're walking across a hot parking lot or something, you alternate which foot is touching that blacktop at any given point, sort of thing.
Wow, that's great teamwork. I love it.
I was about to say, teamwork makes the dream work. That's how you do it.
Wow.
That's a good lesson in parenting, too.
Honey, it's your turn to burrow into the snake dens, like lizard dens. Sorry, I just had to.
No, that was much appreciated. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for joining us. Thank you, all of our listeners, for tuning in. Alex, you can find him on Twitter. His @ is Champagne Labs USI, so champ, like champion, CHAMP, AGNE, Lab USI. And you can't miss it. His picture is his face on a bird body. So you've come to the right place if you have found that. Interactome, lot less exciting. We are at the Interactome on Twitter and then Interactome_media on Instagram. Feel free to give us a follow to stay tuned. But Alex, thank you so much. This was a great episode. We all learned a lot, so really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is just such a nice podcast that you all have, and I was just thrilled to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. I learned so much. My brain is exploding with cool bird facts now.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the cooler episodes that I think we've done.
Now you can go and interact with all these bird people, and now you're going to impress them, right?
Yay.
Exactly.
You guys asked me what my favorite bird was. What do you guys have favorite birds?
Natalie?
I do. My favorite bird is a black-capped chickadee because it reminds me of home growing up. They're the state bird of Massachusetts. They're one of my favorites. Bird that I loved growing up were blue jays. I just thought they were so big, so blue, so loud, and I would always hear them in the backyard. I just thought they were so cool. They're actually bullies in the bird world. Blue jays are really mean, but they look really cool. And then I encountered a piping plover a few years ago on a Massachusetts beach, which was truly like very rare bird or very at-risk bird in Massachusetts. And they're beautiful. They're adorable. So,
wow. I feel like I like penguins.
Penguins, that's a good one.
I kept on bringing up penguins, and I think that's probably why. But I don't know. I always found them very like cute and adorable, and like March of the Penguins really got me as a kid. Was very emotionally attached to Margaret the Penguin's Happy Feet was also integral, I think, to my opinion of penguins. So, but I do enjoy penguins in all their shapes and forms as well. There's so much diversity there as well. I just think they're so funny and like cute. So I love penguins.
Penguins are so cute. For me, I'm between two. I think like in birds in general, in terms of like your more general basic birds, I think cardinals bring me a lot of comfort for whatever reason when I see them. I think they're beautiful. It's very rare, I feel, that I see that deep red color in nature, just like naturally occurring. And I just think they're beautiful. And even the females, like they're a little more brown and muted, but like they have these really distinct orange beaks, and I don't know, I just really like cardinals. But then outside of that, I am a huge fan of owls. I think they're so goofy. I know they're not supposed to be goofy, but I think they look really goofy, especially like in the light. They look a little like disgruntled, but I think they're just like majestic birds. Birds of prey in general are really, really cool.
As long as you're not a mouse, you can feel free to call an owl goofy, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I loved what you said about the California condors. I'd really love to be able to see one day. I heard that the wingspan is so huge, like 13 feet or something like that. Like, I don't know what I would do with myself if I saw one in real life.
Yeah, the one I saw was in the Grand Canyon. And, we were there for like a week and I was looking for them every day. I didn't think I was going to see it, but then on the last day, there was one just sitting there. So I didn't get to see its wingspan, but it was sitting next to a turkey vulture, which is normally we think of as a pretty big bird, but it was just dwarfing this thing.
Oh.
Wow.
It was amazing.